Moving Forward, Adventures in Tangles and Liberation, a contemplative story poem for inspiration, by Lindsay Cochin. He sat alone with his thoughts, awaiting the spark of infallible plans to extinguish the dark. But threads of ideas brought sloughs of self-doubt, about lacking skills or adequate clout. Just the chance of not garnering sufficient respect had a discouraging, crushing effect. So he continued to cycle through frustrating thoughts while plans came undone or got tied up in knots. One day he saw what inertia had brought. The longer he waited, the more tangled things got. The more he compared his lot to his peers, the more he felt trapped amidst judgments and fears. And when he believed what the thoughts seemed to say, they obscured his view further and got in his way. With his hands on his head, he uttered a call, "I'd rather move some than not move at all." Since chasing his thoughts had not been of much use, he turned to the tangles to shake himself loose. He tugged at cords here, shifted things there, and freed up some strands, which caused others to snare. He noticed a trend, that each force caused the next, in an ongoing appearance of cause and effects. But with knots around his feet, he felt stifled and glum, and asked, "What events have caused this outcome?" As if in response, the strings stirred and replied by revealing past webs of knots that were tied. He saw strands of strand and threads of thread, vines of vine and webs of web, infinite layers of a winding course stemming from some unseeable source. His knots were part of an historical chain that brought his birth, his life, and his pain. And since this moment might impact the rest, he saw every small effort as wise to invest. Thinking each step could guide life as a whole, turned tangles in hand into reins of control. He steered this way for gain and that way for cheer, dodging loss, annoyance, and fear. He followed the threads that led him to skills that built his esteem and covered his bills. But despite how he could solve knots that accrued, he found every day that the tangles renewed. And despite obtaining what boons he yearned for, he couldn't quite help but keep craving more. Always there came something bigger to want, if not to enjoy, then maybe to flaunt. And some knots appeared to get tougher with time, more complex, tighter, or covered in grime, dependent upon all things going well so that he could avoid getting bound up in a hell. He found himself oscillating between gladness and grief and cycling in loops in search of relief. Discouraged by attempts to conquer the string, he opted to see what pausing could bring. In stillness, he could release a great sigh. With emotions now easier to identify, he noticed annoyance tied to a sting beneath layers of tightly coiled string. Thorns were poking into his side. When pushed or pulled, jabs intensified. Tugging one barb would push others in more, a pattern that he could no longer ignore. While avoiding thorns seemed to cause them to grow, seeing himself notice this helped knots to let go. And when knots released, thorns eased up too. He learned throughout the calm breaths that he drew that each thorn had roots which wove into thread that covered his body and wound round his head. And when he observed a knot right to its base, the thorn could fall out, leaving only its trace. Now armed with a way to feel less constrained, he resolved to stop battling the thorns that remained. He sat in silence with those barbs and their knots, observing sensations and noticing thoughts, offering them all a calm place to exist, as tangles, by grace, found ways to untwist. He then followed some strands winding up to his chest, where they emerged in a frayed, tattered mess. At the spot where his heart would logically be, were strings that flailed as if wailing a plea. At first, what to do was not very clear. Would phrase need some weaving, removal, a shear? They moved as if they had will of their own, reaching like tentacles towards something unknown. And whenever they grasped, they'd quickly withdraw, for whatever they touched felt searing and raw. But he knew there was logic to each wandering strand, whose yearnings he didn't quite yet understand. Driven to settle the strings of his heart, he searched the world for what it could impart. Countless paths offered countless hopes, all casting at him their own nets and ropes. Some promised acceptance, but on limiting terms, their kindness as skittish and slippery as worms. Others promised magic and answers and peace, but their gifts did not last, nor lead angst to cease. So he called, "Could what I'm missing please come to me, 'cause I don't know what else to do, try, or see." And so golden threads sprouted nearby, coiling into words that offered reply. You're a thread in the tapestry of love itself. You're loved and meant to choose love over all else. For once his heartstrings didn't withdraw, they wove into these words of agape and awe that sent light to his veins and rest to his strands, and that revived his heart and unclenched his hands. The comfort he received from this welcome gift was a form of renewal, a transcendent shift. He now felt more willing to accept change and flow, to appreciate strings moving fast, moving slow. And when he saw others trapped in their knots of fighting what is or battling thoughts, he recalled what it's like to get tangled and snared, and how most don't want to feel trapped or scared. He did what he could to help suffering cease, to help others trade knots and thorns for some peace. And he wished for himself that he'd fully unwind all the webs in his midst that kept him confined. But when under those knots he found only more string, whether he looked at himself or something, he realized all essence and matter entwined. Nothing separate about him wouldn't unwind. What he called self seemed to forever uncurl and reveal its oneness with universal swirl. There was nothing to do now, nowhere to go, just this moment in time for things to be so. In here and now, there was flow all around, the cycles of water between air and the ground, the invisible paths birds take spring and fall, the meridians and fibers coursing us all, the process of change from larva to moth, the journey from sheep to thread to cloth, the struggles that bend us, the strengths that we flex, the trip consciousness takes from this life to what's next. In such awareness, his perspective was vast, beyond any clinging to future or past, beyond any judgments he'd be tempted to make, or regrets and fears that would have kept him awake. Yet he retained an eye for what's true and what's right, and kept upward aims clearly in sight as he looked for beauty and joy and grace, and began to see them all over the place. In a spirit of play, he saw opportunity to allow truth and love to work through me. End of part 1.